Sunset paints the Valley of the Kings in deep gold and shadow. For the pharaohs buried here, death was not an ending but a meticulously planned launch into eternity. This is the story of how an entire civilization lived with one eye fixed on the afterlife, turning their greatest fear into their most profound art. By the end, you will understand the complete blueprint they followed to cheat oblivion, from sacred chemistry to hidden curses. We will uncover how a king's final journey required 70 days of ritual, tons of stone, and the labor of a dedicated city. What does a society become when it dedicates its finest resources and mines solely to the world of the dead? The entire staggering enterprise of tomb building and mummification served a single, breathtakingly ambitious goal. For the ancient Egyptians, death was a doorway, but walking through it required the self to survive the journey intact. They believed a person was not just one thing, but a collection of vital spiritual forces. First was the Ka, your life force or spiritual double, born with you. It needed a home, which is why the preserved body was so critical. Then there was the Ba, often shown as a bird with a human head, representing your unique personality and mobility, able to leave the tomb but needing to return. The ultimate aim was to unite these with the final component, the transfigured spirit called the Akh, to become an effective, eternal being in the afterlife. But this reunion was not guaranteed. It was a fragile process that demanded meticulous preparation. The body had to be recognizable for the Ka and Ba to find it, hence the need for mummification and lifelike statues as backup. The tomb was not merely a burial chamber, it was a storage depot, a chapel, and a permanent address for these spiritual components, stocked with everything from food to furniture to sustain them. Their destination, if all went well, was a mirror of Egypt itself, a perfect, fertile paradise known as the Field of Reeds. Yet to get there, the soul had to navigate the Duat, a terrifying, labyrinthine underworld filled with demons, lakes of fire, and deceptive gatekeepers. Every ritual, every amulet, every painted scene on the tomb wall was a piece of a survival kit for this most perilous of journeys. Death was a test, and the pharaoh's preparations were his only study guide for the final, eternal exam. With this cosmic goal in mind, the tomb itself became the most critical piece of technology they could build. It was far more than a hidden grave. Think of it as a sacred machine, a carefully engineered device designed with one function, to process a dead king and output a living god. This explains the obsessive secrecy and staggering effort poured into the Valley of the Kings. The site was chosen with ruthless logic. Tucked behind a wall of sheer limestone cliffs, it was naturally defensible, a fortress against the grave robbers who had already stripped the pyramids bare. Dominating the skyline was a peak the locals called Alquan, the Horn, its shape eerily mimicking a natural pyramid, a constant reminder of the solar ascension the pharaoh sought. This mountain was sacred to Meretseja, a fierce goddess whose name meant she who loves silence, the guardian of this silent, sacred necropolis. Walking into one of these tombs was never a simple stroll. You were enacting a ritual descent. The standard design was a long, sloping corridor that cut deep into the heart of the mountain. This was a physical map of the soul's journey, representing the descent into the dark, labyrinthine Duat. The first major barrier was often a deep, vertical shaft cut right into the floor. Archaeologists call it a well shaft, and it served a brilliant dual purpose. Practically, it captured any flash floodwaters that might seep in, protecting the inner chambers. Spiritually, it was a pit to trap evil forces or demons that might try to follow the king inward. Beyond it, you might find a pillared hall, its columns standing in for the sacred plants of the mythical underworld, and finally, the journey ended in the burial chamber itself. Here, in this deepest, most secret room, rested the quartzite or granite sarcophagus, the final shell holding the mummy. The entire architecture was often precisely aligned. Some tombs were oriented so their central axis pointed toward the circumpolar stars, the so-called imperishable ones that never set, symbolizing eternal life. Others aligned with the path of the sun god Ra, ensuring the king's spirit could catch a ride on the solar bark as it traveled through the night. Every angle, every chamber, every step down was a calibrated component in this resurrection machine, built to guide a mortal man through an immortal transformation. Yet this stone machine required its most vital component, a body prepared to last for eternity. The process began not in the dark tomb, but in a place of stark, sacred practicality known as the Beautiful House. This was the embalming workshop, a temporary structure likely erected on the west bank of the Nile, close to the life-giving waters that were its first essential tool. Here, the physical transformation from a mortal king into an eternal deity formally commenced. The very first act was one of profound symbolism. The body was washed with water from the Nile, the same river whose annual floods brought life to the desert. This ritual purification was a spiritual cleansing, a symbolic return to the waters of creation to prepare for a new birth. Overseeing this and every step that followed was a figure both terrifying and holy, the chief embalmer known as the Hairy Sheshta. He did not work as a mere mortician but as a high priest performing the most sacred of rites. During the key rituals, he would don the mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and the guardian of the dead. In that moment, he was no longer a man, he was the god himself, guiding the pharaoh through the first thresholds of the underworld. This set the tone for everything to come. The famed 70-day countdown had begun, but it was not a countdown to decay. It was a countdown to perfection, a meticulous, weeks-long sacred operation designed to create an incorruptible vessel. Every incision, every application of salt, every wrapping of linen was a recited prayer, a physical spell. They were not merely preserving flesh, they were crafting a permanent home for the Ka and a recognizable beacon for the Ba, a divine artifact that would allow a king to claim his place among the gods. The most invasive and sacred step then began, a procedure that was equal parts surgery and liturgy. The chief embalmer, still embodying the god Anubis, would take up a ritual blade made not of metal but of sharp black obsidian. With this sacred tool, he made a single, precise incision on the left side of the body. This was not a random cut. The left side was symbolically linked to the west, the land of the dead, and it provided direct access to the abdominal cavity. Through this opening, the internal organs most prone to rapid decay were carefully removed. The lungs, the liver, the stomach, and the intestines were each meticulously extracted. But these organs were not discarded. The Egyptians believed every part of the body was essential for the afterlife, so each organ was individually cleaned, treated with natron salts, wrapped in linen, and given its own special container. These were the legendary canopic jars, 4 vessels that formed a crucial part of the tomb's equipment. Each jar was placed under the protection of one of the 4 sons of Horus, guardian deities who watched over these vital parts. Seti, with a human head, protected the liver. Hapi, the baboon-headed god, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, with the head of a jackal, watched over the stomach. And Khebesenu, who had the head of a falcon, was the protector of the intestines. Yet there were 2 profound exceptions to this removal process. The first was the heart. It was left carefully in place inside the chest cavity. In Egyptian thought, the heart was not just an organ. It was the very seat of a person's mind, their emotions, their conscience, and their moral character. It would be needed for the most critical judgment in the afterlife, the weighing of the heart ceremony, where it would be balanced against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. A heavy heart burdened with sin would be devoured, condemning the soul to oblivion. The second exception was the brain, which was considered utterly useless, mere stuffing for the skull. To remove it, the embalmers would insert a long, hooked bronze rod up through the nostrils, carefully breaking the ethmoid bone to reach the cranial cavity. They would then swirl the instrument around to liquefy the brain matter, turn the body over, and let it drain out through the nose. The empty skull was often later packed with resin-soaked linen to maintain its shape. Every act, from the reverent preservation of the heart to the dismissive extraction of the brain, was guided by a deep spiritual map of what constituted the true self, preserving only what was necessary for eternity. With the body now an empty vessel, the most critical phase of preservation could begin. The Egyptians turned to a humble but miraculous substance pulled from the dry lake beds to the northwest, a place called Wadi Natron. This was the source of natron, a naturally occurring mixture of salts including sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and sodium chloride. To them, it was more than just salt. It was the divine sweat of the gods, a purifying agent with almost magical properties. Its brilliance lay in its dual action. First, it was powerfully hygroscopic, meaning it greedily pulled moisture out of anything it touched, desiccating tissues and halting bacterial growth. Second, as it absorbed water, it created a highly alkaline environment, a chemical landscape where decay-causing microorganisms simply could not survive. This was not magic, it was sophisticated, empirical chemistry perfected over centuries of observation and practice. The embalmers would first pack the emptied abdominal and chest cavities with temporary linen bags filled with loose natron salt. Then the entire body was laid on a sloped embalming table and completely buried under a small mountain of the white crystalline powder. Here it would remain untouched for 40 days. This period was not arbitrary. It was the precise amount of time the Egyptians observed it took for the desert to completely dry a corpse, and it mirrored the length of the Nile's inundation, another cycle of death and rebirth. The transformation was radical. As the natron did its work, the body lost a staggering amount of its weight, over 75% of its water content. The skin shrank tight against the bones, becoming dark, dry, and leathery. This is the crucial detail often missed. The body was not soaked in a liquid natron bath, a common modern misconception. A bath would have led to rapid decomposition, a swollen, ruined mess. Instead, the dry salt treatment was a masterpiece of passive preservation, a slow, relentless drawing out of all fluid life, leaving behind a stable, lightweight shell perfectly prepared for the next, more artistic phase of the ritual. After 40 days in the dry embrace of the natron salts, the body was ready for its rebirth. The desiccated remains were carefully lifted from the white crystals and brought to a cleansing station. Here, the embalmers performed a second, deeply symbolic washing, rinsing away the salts with water and palm wine. This act purified the physical shell and represented a renewal, a spiritual emergence from the desiccated state of the dead. Next came the anointing, a profoundly sacred moment. Using precious oils of cedar, myrrh, and cinnamon, the priest gently massaged the stiffened limbs and leathery skin. This was not merely about adding fragrance. The resins and oils penetrated the dried tissues, restoring a degree of suppleness and providing a protective, waterproof coating. To the Egyptians, these costly substances were the very sweat of the gods, and their application transformed the body into something divine, perfumed for eternity. The empty cavities, once home to organs, were now packed with clean linen, aromatic sawdust, and even onions for their symbolic protective qualities, restoring the body's lifelike shape. Sometimes the skin itself was painted with a thin layer of red ochre for men or yellow ochre for women, a final touch to mimic the vibrant glow of life. The king was being physically and spiritually reconstituted, prepared to become a vessel worthy of eternity. Now began the most time-consuming and ritually charged phase of all, the wrapping. This process could take 15 more days and required hundreds of yards of the finest linen. It is a poignant detail that much of this linen was not woven specifically for death. It was often recycled from the household, taken from the pharaoh's own bedsheets or clothing, imbued with the memory of his daily life. each strip, ranging from narrow ribbons to broad sheets, was meticulously prepared. The wrapping was a slow, deliberate ceremony performed by priests who recited spells with every pass of the cloth. Their goal was not to simply bundle a body, but to ritually recreate it as a sacred, protected entity. The first layers often bound the fingers and toes individually, then the limbs, before enveloping the entire torso. But this linen shell was far more than fabric. Between the layers, at specific points corresponding to vital spiritual centers, the priests placed powerful amulets, each a piece of divine armor for the journey ahead. Over the heart, they positioned the heart scarab, a stone beetle inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, pleading with the heart not to testify against its owner during the final judgment. On the throat, they might place a gold collar or the two fingers amulet, meant to ensure the deceased could still breathe and speak in the afterlife. Along the spine, they secured the Jed pillar, a symbol of stability and the backbone of the god Osiris, promising resurrection and strength. Every amulet had a precise, non-negotiable function, a piece of code in the ritual program designed to safeguard the soul. Integral to this protective cocoon were the written spells themselves. Long papyrus scrolls containing chapters from the Book of the Dead were sometimes placed within the bandages, or crucial passages were copied directly onto the linen strips. These were not general well-wishes, they were precise operational instructions and potent incantations. A spell might grant the knowledge of how to breathe air and drink water in the afterlife, or provide the secret names of the ferocious guardians at the underworld's gates, allowing the soul safe passage. The wrapping, therefore, became a literal text, a three-dimensional book of magic encasing the body. The final layers were often secured with tree resin, which hardened into a strong, protective shell. The result was no longer a dried corpse, but a sanctified, invulnerable form, a human-shaped icon ready for its final casing. The mummy was now a composite being, part flesh, part linen, part jewel, and part sacred text, a masterpiece of ritual engineering designed to withstand the ravages of time and the perils of the underworld. It was a body reborn not for life, but for an existence beyond it. But even this masterpiece of bandages and amulets was not the final form. The wrapped mummy now received its most iconic and public face, the death mask. This was not a decorative cover, but a critical piece of spiritual technology. Its primary function was to provide a perfect, permanent, and instantly recognizable face for the Ba soul. Imagine the Ba, that bird with a human head, fluttering back to the tomb after its journeys. It needed to find its body in the darkness to reunite with the Ka. The mummy beneath the wrappings, after its drastic transformation, might not be easily identifiable. The death mask solved this. It presented an idealized, ageless, and radiant portrait of the deceased in their prime, a flawless beacon for the returning spirit. The most famous example, of course, is the solid gold mask of Tutankhamun, a breathtaking object that has come to symbolize ancient Egypt itself, but its beauty was secondary to its profound symbolism. The material was everything. Gold was not chosen for mere wealth. It was considered the flesh of the gods, imperishable and shining like the sun. Silver, often used for the eyes inlaid within gold masks, was thought to be the bones of the gods. For those who could not afford solid gold, masks were crafted from cartonnage, a versatile material made of layers of linen and plaster that could be molded, gilded, and painted in brilliant detail. Even wood, carefully carved and covered in gold leaf, served the same sacred purpose. Every element of the mask's design was a statement of divine status. The striped Nemes headcloth, the same headdress worn by living pharaohs, framed the face. A braided false beard, often curled at the end, signified association with Osiris, the god of the dead and resurrection. A broad, ornate collar of inlaid semi-precious stones covered the shoulders, representing both protection and high status. Inscriptions from the Book of the Dead, calling upon gods for protection, were frequently etched on the back or the shoulders, turning the mask itself into a spoken prayer. This obsession with a recognizable identity extended far beyond the mask. Throughout the tomb, statues of the king were placed in special niches called serdabs. These were not mere memorials, they were reserved bodies, alternative vessels for the Ka should the mummy itself ever be destroyed. In earlier times, nobles had even placed incredibly lifelike limestone reserve heads in their tombs, hauntingly individual portraits meant to serve the same fail-safe function. The message was clear: one body, one face was too precious to risk. For the Egyptians, eternity was too long to leave anything to chance. They built redundancy into the very heart of their faith, ensuring that even if time stole the flesh, the gold mask would still shine, the stone statue would still stand, and the soul would always have a home to return to. Protected by its golden face, the king's body now needed a fortress. This final sanctuary came in the form of nested containers, each layer a world of its own. The first layer was the innermost coffin, a masterpiece of wood and gold shaped precisely like a human form. This was not a simple box, it was a miniature tomb, a perfect replica of the divine body it contained. Its surface was a dense tapestry of magic. Painted or inlaid upon it were the watchful eyes of the god Horus, images of protective deities like the winged goddess Isis, and column after column of hieroglyphic spells from the Book of the Dead. A crucial feature was the false door painted on the side. This was not a physical opening but a spiritual portal, a designated channel through which the Ba soul could come and go, moving between the confines of the coffin and the wider world of the tomb. This human-shaped coffin was then placed inside one, or sometimes even two, larger rectangular outer coffins. These were also covered in sacred texts and imagery, creating a series of shrinking, protective walls around the mummy. But even this elaborate wooden nest was not considered sufficient for a pharaoh. The final, ultimate shield was the sarcophagus. This was the stone shell, a colossal container carved from a single, immense block. For the greatest kings, the preferred material was red quartzite, a stone that shimmered with the color of the rising sun, symbolizing rebirth. Others used granite for its eternal hardness or limestone for its workability. The engineering of this object was a feat in itself. A royal sarcophagus could weigh over 10 tons. It had to be hollowed out with painstaking precision, its walls carved thin enough to be elegant yet strong enough to bear immense weight, its interior surface often polished to a smooth finish. The lid alone could weigh several tons. The logistical challenge of getting this monolithic object into the tomb was staggering. It had to be brought into the burial chamber early in the tomb's construction, dragged down the long, sloping corridors on wooden sledges lubricated with water or oil by teams of workers straining in the cramped, dusty darkness. Once it was positioned in the exact center of the chamber, the intricate wall decorations and paintings were completed around it. The entire tomb was, in a sense, built outward from this sacred stone vessel. On the day of burial, the nested coffins containing the mummy would be lowered inside this granite or quartzite shell. The heavy lid would be slid into place, often sealed with mortar. In that moment, the pharaoh was encased within a perfect, multi-layered universe. From the innermost bandages to the outermost stone, he was surrounded by spells, gods, and symbols, a Russian doll of divine protection designed to endure until the end of time itself. But a perfect vessel and a sealed fortress were not enough for the journey ahead. The tomb now had to be transformed into a fully functional household, stocked for an eternity of comfortable living. The burial chamber and its adjoining rooms were meticulously packed with everything a divine king might need in the next world. This was not a random collection of treasures, but a carefully curated inventory for daily life in miniature. They brought beds and chairs of ebony and ivory, intricately inlaid with gold. They included chests filled with fine linen clothing, sandals, and ceremonial robes. There were ornate jewelry boxes holding collars of faience and carnelian, rings and bracelets, all for adornment in the eternal field of reeds. Even weapons were placed nearby, not for earthly battle, but to symbolically defend against the chaotic forces of the underworld. Yet the most telling items were often the most ordinary. Archaeologists find bronze razors for shaving, cosmetic kits with kohl eyeliner, and wooden headrests for sleeping. They discover board games, most famously one called Senet, believed to be a symbolic game representing the soul's perilous journey through the Duat, and of course there was food. Alabaster jars held precious oils and wine, while baskets contained real, desiccated loaves of bread, joints of meat, and bundles of onions. The belief was stunningly literal. Through the power of ritual magic, specifically the climactic opening of the mouth ceremony performed on the mummy and its statues, every one of these objects would be awakened. A priest would touch the mouth of a statue or a painted image of a loaf of bread with a ceremonial adze, reciting spells that granted it the ability to breathe, eat, and function. The painted bread on the wall would become real nourishment. The wooden model of a servant carrying a tray would become a living attendant. The entire tomb was thus activated, its contents transformed from mere representations into a functioning, eternal estate. But who would tend to this estate? Who would till the celestial fields or fetch the water in the afterlife? The Egyptians had an ingenious and, frankly, very practical solution. They created shabti figures. These were small mummiform statuettes, often carved from faience, wood, or stone, and they served one explicit purpose: to act as a substitute labor force for the deceased. A single tomb could contain hundreds of them, each one equipped with tiny painted or carved tools like hoes and baskets. Their magic was in the inscription, a spell from the Book of the Dead that was almost like a programming command. A typical shabti spell reads, "If I am called upon, if I am counted upon to do any work that is done in the afterlife, you shall detail yourself for me on every occasion of making arable the fields, of flooding the banks, of ferrying sand from east to west. Here I am, you shall say." It was a contract in clay. Should the gods summon the pharaoh to perform any manual labor, the shabti would answer the call and do the work in his stead. For a king, there might be an entire overseer shabti for every 10 worker shabtis, a complete bureaucratic management system for eternity. This reveals the breathtaking completeness of their vision. They prepared for every contingency, from the cosmic threat of a demon at a gate to the mundane chore of irrigating a field. The tomb was not a monument to death, but a fully operational launchpad for an endless, perfected life. The most vital provision for this eternal estate was not gold, but grain. To sustain the Ka, the life force that remained in the tomb, required a constant, reliable source of nourishment. The Egyptians believed hunger and thirst could still torment the dead, a fate worse than oblivion. So the tomb was stocked with the staples of the Egyptian diet: loaves of bread in dozens of shapes, jars of beer, wine, and water, joints of beef and poultry, baskets of dates, figs, and onions. These were real, physical supplies meant for immediate consumption in the afterlife, yet they presented a stark logistical problem: real food decays. A loaf of bread, no matter how well baked, would crumble to dust in a century, let alone eternity. The ancient planners had to devise a system that could provide fresh sustenance forever, and they built a brilliant 2-part economy to solve it. The first part was a spiritual supply chain anchored in the world of the living. For a pharaoh, this meant the construction of a mortuary temple separate from the hidden tomb. This temple, built on the edge of the cultivated fields near the Nile, was a public institution with a single, sacred purpose: to feed the dead king. It was endowed with vast tracts of farmland, herds of cattle, and workshops staffed by a permanent, state-supported priesthood. Every single day, without fail, priests would perform the offering ritual in the temple's inner sanctuary. They would present fresh bread, pour out beer and wine, and recite the king's name and titles, formally transferring the essence or ka of the food to the deceased. This was not a symbolic gesture. They believed the ritual actually transmitted the spiritual nourishment across the divide, replenishing the royal ka in its distant tomb. The system was funded in perpetuity by the temple's agricultural estates, creating a divine welfare program that turned grain into eternity. But what if the priests failed? What if the temple fell into ruin or the offerings ceased? The Egyptians, masters of ritual redundancy, had a backup plan built directly into the tomb's walls. This is where the second part of the economy, the magical supply chain, took over. The walls of the burial chamber and adjacent rooms were painted with magnificent, detailed scenes of abundance. You would see vast processions of offering bearers carrying baskets overflowing with produce. There were intricate depictions of entire bakeries and breweries in operation, showing every step from grinding grain on a quern stone to shaping dough and fermenting beer in large jars. There were painted menus, long lists of every desirable food and drink itemized for the gods. The magic was in the activation. During the opening of the mouth ceremony, these images were ritually brought to life. A priest would touch the mouth of a painted ox or a depicted loaf with his adze, and through the power of the spoken spell, that image would become a perpetual source of sustenance. The painted bread could be eaten, the carved beer jar could be drunk from forever. They even placed small, perfect models of food production, tiny granaries, miniature kitchens with figures baking bread that served the same eternal purpose. This combination of physical ritual and magical representation created an unbreakable safety net. It meant the king's car would be fed by daily priestly rites for as long as the state endured, and by the painted spells on the wall for as long as the tomb itself stood. His eternity was literally baked into the very stones around him. Yet all these physical and magical preparations would be useless if the soul got lost on the way. For that final, most perilous leg of the journey, the Egyptians created the ultimate travel guide, a text we know as the Book of the Dead. This name is actually a modern invention, a mistranslation of its ancient title, which meant the Book of Coming Forth by Day. That title reveals everything. It was not a book about death, but a manual for escaping it, for emerging victorious into the dawn light of the afterlife. It was not a single, standardized scripture, but a personalized anthology of roughly 200 spells, from which a wealthy individual would select a custom collection. A priest would commission a scribe to copy the chosen spells onto a papyrus scroll, often with beautiful, full-color illustrations, and this unique document would be placed in the tomb, sometimes tucked within the mummy's wrappings itself. For those of lesser means, the most crucial spells might be painted directly onto the coffin or the tomb walls, ensuring the instructions were always within reach. This was a practical, bespoke guidebook for navigating the unimaginable. Its purpose was brutally clear: to equip the deceased with the knowledge and magic needed to survive the Duat. Think of it as a combination of a travelogue, a phrasebook, and a survival manual for a land where every step held a new threat. One spell might provide the secret name of a demon guarding a fiery lake, allowing the soul to command it to stand aside. Another would give the exact magical password required to pass through one of the many gates, each manned by a god who held a knife. There were hymns to recite to appease angry deities, and spells to transform the traveler into a swallow for swift flight, or a crocodile for defense, or even a lotus flower to remain unseen. The most famous of all is spell 125, the scene of the final judgment. This is where the negative confession takes place. Standing before a tribunal of 42 gods, the deceased would declare his innocence of a long list of sins, proclaiming, "I have not stolen. I have not caused anyone to weep. I have not killed." This was not a confession of wrongdoing, but a declaration of a life lived in balance with Ma'at, the cosmic order of truth and justice. Then came the climactic moment, the weighing of the heart. The deceased's heart, believed to hold all their deeds, was placed on one scale. On the other side was the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of perfect truth. If the heart was light, balanced by a life of virtue, the deceased was declared true of voice and welcomed into the field of reeds. If it was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by the monstrous goddess Ammit, the Devourer, a creature part lion, part hippo, and part crocodile, resulting in a second permanent death. Another vital section was Spell 17, a complex hymn concerning solar rebirth. It helped the soul understand the nature of the sun god Ra and his nightly journey through the Duat, providing the knowledge to merge with his solar bark and be reborn with him at dawn. This collection of spells, therefore, was the final, indispensable piece of software for the soul's journey. It turned a terrifying voyage into the unknown into a navigable, if still dangerous, pilgrimage with every password, every map, and every contingency plan written down in advance. This detailed map of the afterlife was not a comforting paradise but a brutal gauntlet. The Duat, as described in secret texts like the Amduat and the Book of Gates, was a terrifying, inverted world. It was a vast subterranean cavern, dark and flooded with primordial waters, divided into 12 distinct regions. Each region corresponded to one of the 12 hours of the night, and the entire harrowing journey had to be completed before dawn. This was the nightly route of the sun god Ra, whose solar bark sailed through this underworld, and the soul of the deceased pharaoh aimed to hitch a ride on that divine vessel. To succeed, he needed to know the landscape intimately. The first hours were a descent into deepening gloom, where the soul had to merge with the body of Osiris, the god of the dead, in a union that promised regeneration. Later regions presented surreal and deadly geography. There were winding, sand-filled paths where one could lose their way forever. There were lakes of fire that only the righteous could cross, and mystical mounds where the gods of creation were said to dwell. The inhabitants of this realm were a mixture of the divine and the monstrous. Helpful gods like Heka, the personification of magic itself, could offer power. Beneficent spirits might guide the way, but around every corner lurked existential threats. Serpent demons with multiple heads waited in the darkness. Decapitated deities stood at narrow gates armed with knives, demanding the correct magical password before they would let a soul pass. The greatest enemy of all was the giant serpent Apep, the embodiment of chaos and destruction, who tried to swallow Ra's bark whole every single night. The rituals performed in the tomb, the amulets placed on the mummy, and every spell in the Book of the Dead were direct countermeasures to these specific, documented dangers. Knowing the name of a gatekeeper demon gave you power over it. A spell that transformed you into a heron allowed you to fly over a lake of fire. The painted scenes on the tomb wall were not mere decoration. They were rehearsal spaces, allowing the king's spirit to practice navigating this horrific terrain again and again before the real journey began. His entire preparation was an attempt to turn the unknown into the known, to replace terror with a detailed itinerary for the most dangerous trip he would ever take. The soul's navigation through the Duat had one final, inescapable destination. At the end of the perilous night journey, the deceased would stand in the silent, awe-inspiring Hall of Two Truths. This was the courtroom of eternity, and the judge was none other than Osiris himself, the resurrected god-king who ruled the land of the dead. He sat enthroned, wrapped in the white mummy bandages of rebirth, his green skin symbolizing renewal, holding the crook and flail of kingship. The atmosphere was one of profound and terrifying solemnity. This was not a place for excuses or appeals, it was the ultimate audit of a lifetime. The ritual that unfolded here was the single most important moment in the Egyptian concept of the afterlife, the weighing of the heart. The heart, carefully left within the mummified body, was believed to be the seat of memory, conscience, and moral character. It was not just an organ, it was a living record of every action, thought, and intention. In the hall, the god Anubis, in his role as psychopomp, would gently take the symbolic or spiritual heart of the deceased and place it upon one pan of a great golden scale. On the other side, perfectly counterbalanced, was the single, luminous feather of Ma'at. Ma'at was not just a goddess, she was the fundamental principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice that held the universe together. Her feather represented perfect harmony, the weightless ideal of a life lived in balance. The entire assembly of gods watched in silence as the scale began to move. If the heart was light, free from the burden of wrongdoing, it would balance exactly with the feather. But if it was heavy with lies, greed, cruelty, or injustice, the scale would tip downward. The consequence was immediate and horrifying. Waiting beside the scales was the monster Ammit, the devourer of the dead. She was a composite creature of their three most feared predators: the head of a crocodile for the terror of the river, the forequarters of a lion for the power of the desert, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus for the unpredictable danger of the marshes. If the heart failed the test, she would lunge forward, consume it, and the soul would cease to exist, suffering a second, permanent death called oblivion. The meticulous scribe of the gods, Thoth, the ibis-headed lord of wisdom and writing, stood ready to record the verdict on his papyrus scroll. His presence ensured the judgment was absolute and final. To prepare for this moment, the deceased did not remain silent. Before the weighing, they would recite a powerful declaration known today as the negative confession. Facing a panel of 42 divine judges, each associated with a specific sin and a region of Egypt, the soul would proclaim its innocence. The declarations were remarkably specific and ethical, covering a vast spectrum of human behavior. They would say, "I have not stolen, I have not caused anyone to weep, I have not told lies, I have not committed adultery, I have not reduced the grain measure. I have not harmed the cattle, I have not blocked the flow of water." This was not a confession of guilt, but a bold, magical assertion of a life lived in alignment with Ma'at. The spells in the Book of the Dead were designed to ensure the heart would not betray its owner, even instructing it to remain silent. This ceremony reveals the profound moral core at the heart of Egyptian religion. Eternal life was not a guaranteed reward for wealth or power. It was the earned prize for ethical conduct. A pharaoh, for all his divine status, had to pass this same test as the humblest farmer. Their staggering material preparations, the tombs and the gold, were merely the vessel. The true cargo for eternity was a heart light enough to balance a feather. Yet a heart judged true still needed a home that would remain undisturbed. All the spells and amulets were powerless if a thief could simply walk in and smash the mummy to steal its gold. The Egyptians lived with a constant, chilling fear of tomb robbery, a crime they saw as a direct assault on eternity itself. To counter this, they engineered a system of security that blended brute physical barriers with potent psychological warfare. Forget the Hollywood fantasy of giant rolling boulders and poisoned darts. Their methods were far more practical and in many ways more clever. The first line of defense was obscurity and misdirection. Tombs were hidden in a remote, desolate valley, their entrances often carved high on cliff faces or concealed behind piles of rubble. Once a burial was complete, work gangs would sometimes block the descending corridor by completely filling it with thousands of tons of limestone chips and debris, creating a solid, impassable plug of rock that would take robbers weeks to dig through. For the innermost doorways, they employed massive granite portcullises. These were enormous, single-piece slabs of stone, sometimes weighing several tons, that were precariously suspended in vertical slots above a corridor. At the crucial moment, workers would cut the ropes and the slab would crash down, sealing the passage with a permanent, immovable barrier. The deep well shaft we discussed earlier, while spiritual in purpose, also acted as a formidable physical trap for the unwary, a hidden pit in a dark corridor. But physical barriers could be dismantled by determined men with time and tools. So the Egyptians added a second, more terrifying layer of protection: magical and legal deterrence. Inscriptions on tomb walls and stelae served as official curses, threatening divine vengeance on anyone who violated the sacred space. One famous curse from the Middle Kingdom tomb of a man named Ankhtifi reads with stark menace: "As for any ruler, any mayor, any people who shall take possession of this tomb or shall do an evil thing to it, judgment shall be had with them for it by the great God." I shall seize his neck like a bird, I shall cast fear of myself into him. It was a contractual warning, placing the trespasser under the jurisdiction of the gods themselves. The most potent symbol of this state-sanctioned protection was the necropolis seal. This was an actual stamp pressed into the clay used to seal a tomb's doorway or storage chest. Its image was unmistakable and terrifying. The figure of Anubis, the jackal god of embalming, crouched over 9 bound captives, representing the traditional enemies of Egypt. This stamp was the official seal of the Theban necropolis administration. It meant the tomb had been inspected, closed, and was now under the protection of both the god and the pharaoh's own officials. To break that seal was not just theft, it was treason against divine and state authority, promising punishment in this life and the next. These combined measures reveal a profound and poignant anxiety. They could build a mountain into a fortress and fill it with magic, but they could never fully trust that eternity would be left alone. Every granite block and every inscribed curse was a plea into the darkness, a hope that the world of the living would respect the forever home of the dead. Yet all these divine protections and eternal maps required a human hand to bring them into being. High above the Valley of the Kings, carved into the barren hillside, sat a remarkable secret. This was Deir el-Medina, a purpose-built, walled village housing the very artisans and laborers who constructed the pharaoh's tomb. They were not slaves, but a highly skilled, state-employed workforce, and their entire world was dedicated to a single, sacred industry, building eternity for someone else. Their lives were a strange mix of privilege and isolation. They received generous monthly rations of grain, fish, vegetables, and water delivered from the royal granaries. They were provided with tools, lamp oil, and even firewood. In return, they lived in a closed community, their movements monitored, their work a closely guarded state secret. They built modest but comfortable mud brick homes, often 2 stories tall, with courtyards and small household shrines. They worshipped their own patron gods, like the cobra goddess Meretseja, she who loves silence, who watched over the valley. Most surprisingly, these workers had a voice. Ancient records, like the famous Turin Strike papyrus, tell us that when their rations were delayed 1 month in the 12th century before the Common Era, they did the unthinkable. They laid down their tools, walked out of the valley, and staged a sit-in at a nearby temple, effectively going on strike until their pay was delivered. This reveals a sophisticated labor force aware of its own value, negotiating with the very government it served. Their work was a meticulous assembly line of sacred art. It began with the scribes and draftsmen who worked from detailed plans. Using cords dipped in red paint, they snapped guidelines across the rough limestone walls to create a precise grid. This grid was the foundation for every figure, ensuring the proportions of gods and kings were perfect. Then the sculptors moved in. With copper chisels and stone hammers, they carved the grid lines into the rock, creating raised reliefs. The stone cutters, the quarrymen, and the water carriers formed a constant chain of labor, removing debris and keeping the air breathable with the flicker of oil lamps. Finally, the painters arrived. Their palette was mineral-based and brilliant. Red and yellow ochre from the desert, crushed green malachite, blue from precious lapis lazuli, or a synthetic substitute called Egyptian blue. They worked with reed brushes, filling the carved outlines with vibrant life, turning the dark tunnels into a luminous guidebook for the afterlife. These men, and likely some women who managed the village homes, lived in the shadow of death, yet they planned for their own eternities. In the cliffs surrounding their village, they built their own small, beautifully decorated tombs, complete with their own copies of the Book of the Dead. They were not just building a tomb for a king, they were practicing the very rituals they inscribed, hoping to secure their own passage through the same terrifying Duat. The Valley of the Kings was not a silent monument, but a humming, living project sustained by the bread, the artistry, and the quiet hopes of an entire community. The silent tomb and its bustling worker village were only the beginning. For the pharaoh's afterlife to truly function, it required a permanent, living institution. This was the mortuary cult, a dedicated corps of priests whose sole purpose was to maintain the king's memory and feed his eternal spirit day after day for centuries. At magnificent temples like the Ramesseum of Ramesses II or the sprawling Medinet Habu of Ramesses III, a small army of specialists reported for duty every morning. They were known as the servants of the Ka or Ka priests, and their work was the vital, ongoing maintenance for eternity's engine. While the tomb builders could eventually walk away, the Ka priests' task was never finished. Their primary duty was the daily offering ritual, a precise and sacred ceremony performed in the temple's inner sanctuary before a statue of the deceased king. At the appointed hour, a priest would enter the hallowed space, purify himself, and approach the statue. He would present trays of freshly baked bread, pour out jars of cool beer and wine, and lay out cuts of meat and bundles of vegetables. But this was not a symbolic gesture left for the gods to interpret. As he placed each item, he would recite a formal, ritual formula, calling out the king's royal names and titles. This act of speaking the name while presenting the food was the crucial magic. It was believed to actively transfer the essence, the spiritual nourishment of the offerings, directly to the king's Ka in the distant tomb, sustaining his life force just as real food sustains the living. This ritual had to be performed without fail every single day, mirroring the eternal cycle of the sun. A single missed offering could mean a hungry, weakened spirit, a terrifying lapse in the contract with eternity. To fund this endless operation, the mortuary temple was not just a building, it was an economic powerhouse. The pharaoh, while still alive, would endow his temple with vast estates, fertile farmland along the Nile, herds of cattle, workshops, and even entire villages. The income from these holdings, managed by the temple's own administrators, paid for the food, the wine, the linen, and the salaries of the priests themselves. It was a self-sustaining sacred economy, turning the agricultural bounty of Egypt into an eternal pension plan for a god. These priestly positions were coveted and stable, often passed down from father to son, becoming hereditary careers. A son would learn the exact rituals, the correct pronunciations of the ancient offering spells from his father, ensuring an unbroken chain of service. This system transformed the pharaoh's death from a private family affair into a permanent state institution. It created jobs, managed land, and structured time itself around the perpetual care of a single individual's soul. The preparation for death did not end at the tomb's sealed door. It echoed in the daily rhythms of the living, in the grind of grain at the temple bakery and the recited prayers in the dim chapel, a heartbeat of ritual meant to pulse forever. The final, spectacular act of this 70-day ritual was a public performance of profound grief and divine promise. On the appointed day, the king's mummy, now sealed within its nested coffins and resting on a wooden sled, began its last earthly journey. The procession formed on the east bank of the Nile, the side of the rising sun and the living world. With solemn ceremony, the sled was pulled to the river's edge and loaded onto a grand funeral bark, its sails dyed black for mourning. As the boat pushed off into the current, it enacted the most powerful symbol of all, crossing from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead, from the eastern sunrise to the western sunset. Upon reaching the opposite shore, the real labor began. The coffin sled was hauled onto land, and teams of oxen took up the heavy ropes. They dragged the immense weight slowly up the desert path toward the distant, silent cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. This was a staggering physical effort, a literal pulling of the king into eternity, the sled runners carving a temporary scar into the earth that the wind would soon erase. The procession that followed was a moving tableau of an entire society enacting its farewell. Leading the way were priests in pure white linen, shaking sistrum rattles and burning pungent incense to purify the path. Behind the coffin sled came a caravan of staggering wealth and practicality. servants carried chests of jewelry, alabaster jars of ointments, and the king's personal weapons. Others bore furniture, chariots disassembled for transport, and the hundreds of shabty worker statues. Then came the human heart of the spectacle, the mourners. Among them were professional wailing women, their hair disheveled, their robes torn, casting dust upon their heads in a raw, theatrical display of grief. Their cries were not silent, they were a calculated, deafening soundscape of loss meant to echo the cosmic disorder of death itself. A strange and enigmatic figure often moved within this group, known as the Tekanu. It appeared as a shrouded, fetal-shaped bundle on its own small sled, possibly representing an ancient, symbolic human sacrifice or the primal, transformative essence of the king himself. Its true meaning is lost, but its presence added a layer of deep, mysterious ritual to the parade. The climax of this drama occurred at the very mouth of the tomb. Before the coffin could descend into the silent darkness, a final, violent ritual took place. Staged fights would break out between groups of men representing different regions of Egypt. They were not mere performances, but serious physical contests. The purpose was twofold. On a practical level, it may have been a test of the gods' strength and vigilance, proving they were fit to protect the sacred site. On a spiritual level, it was a symbolic defeat of the forces of chaos, a reenactment of the god Horus defeating his enemy Set. By quelling this staged disorder at the threshold, they ensured only perfect order, Ma'at, would enter the tomb with the king. Then, in a moment of supreme gravity, the coffin was tipped upright and carefully guided down the steep entrance ramp, symbolically returning the king to the womb of the goddess Nut, the sky from which he would be reborn. The mourners' cries reached a peak, and then, as the last priest emerged and the first stones were shoved into place to seal the doorway, an absolute silence fell. The public, living world was now severed from the private, eternal one. The spectacle was over. The work of eternity, however, had only just begun within the sealed dark. Silence returned to the valley, but within the sealed tomb, one final, essential act remained. The king's body was in place, his treasures were stored, and his walls were painted with every provision, but none of it was yet alive. The entire complex awaited a single, sacred spark. This was the purpose of the opening of the mouth ceremony, the ritual that would magically transform this silent, stone machine into a vibrant, eternal household. Think of it as the moment you plug in a meticulously built computer and press the power button for the very first time. Every component was ready, but without this final activation, nothing would function. The ceremony was performed by the Sem priest, the highest-ranking ritualist, often the deceased's own son or heir, symbolizing the passing of legacy and life force. He was assisted by a lector priest who held the sacred papyrus scroll, chanting the precise spells that would give the magic its voice. The tools they used were ancient and potent. The most important was the ritual adze, a blade shaped like the constellation Ursa Major, the imperishable stars. This tool, often made of meteoric iron, was believed to contain the essence of the sky itself. They also used the Pesesh Kef, a flint knife with a distinctive forked blade used since the dawn of Egyptian history for cutting the umbilical cord, here symbolizing a new birth. And they employed the foreleg of a freshly sacrificed bull, representing the strength of the god Osiris, and the limb used by the god Horus to magically open the mouth of his murdered father. The ritual was a precise physical operation. The Sem priest would approach the mummy, or more commonly, a life-sized statue of the king that stood outside the tomb for this purpose. With the adze, he would gently touch the statue's mouth, its eyes, its ears, and its nose. Each touch was accompanied by a specific incantation. For the mouth, he might recite, "I open your mouth for you with the adze of iron with which the mouths of the gods were opened." This was not a symbolic gesture. They believed the tool's contact, charged with the spoken spell, literally restored the senses. The mouth could now eat and speak the spells of the underworld. The eyes could now see the light of the afterlife. The ears could hear the prayers of the living. This animation did not stop at the statue. The priest would then move through the tomb, performing the same ritual on the painted and carved images covering the walls. He would touch the mouth of a painted ox, and that ox would become a perpetual source of meat. He would touch the mouth of a depicted servant carrying a wine jug, and that servant would become an eternal attendant. He would even touch the false door on the coffin, activating it as a true spiritual portal. In that moment, the entire tomb awoke. The bread on the offering table was no longer just bread, but eternal sustenance. The beer in the jars was now endless drink. The shabty figures in their rows were now a ready workforce waiting for their command. The ceremony bridged the ultimate gap. It turned art into reality, representation into function, and a collection of objects into a living, breathing estate. The king was no longer a preserved body in a box. He was a sentient being in a functioning home, fully equipped to embark on the journey his people had spent a lifetime preparing him to take. With the tomb now a living, breathing entity, the time had come for the living to leave. This was the moment of ultimate separation, a physical and spiritual sealing of the boundary between two worlds. The priests performed their final incantations in the now still burial chamber, their voices echoing softly against the painted walls for the last time. Then the long, solemn retreat up the sloping corridor began. It was a process in reverse, a meticulous unmaking of their own presence. The first and most definitive barrier was the granite portcullis. This massive slab of stone, already suspended in its slot above a narrow passage, awaited its final command. Workers, with a few sharp blows to the remaining wooden supports, released the ropes. With a thunderous, grinding roar that shook dust from the ceiling, the several-ton block crashed down into its groove, sealing the inner chambers with the permanence of the mountain itself. It was a sound of absolute finality. Further up the corridor, teams of laborers set to work with baskets and ropes, methodically backfilling the passageway with thousands of tons of limestone chips and rubble quarried during the tomb's own excavation. They were not just blocking a door, they were creating a solid, artificial rockfall, a deliberate geological obstacle meant to convince any potential intruder that nothing of value lay beyond. Finally, at the outermost doorway, the last symbolic acts were carried out. The door frame was mortared shut. Then, into the fresh, damp clay, a high official pressed the necropolis seal. The image left behind was small but carried immense weight. The jackal god Anubis crouched over 9 bound foreign captives. This stamp was a legal and divine proclamation. It marked the tomb as inspected, closed, and placed under the protection of both the state and the gods. To break this seal was to invite a curse and commit treason. As the last worker exited the tomb's mouth into the blinding desert sun, the final, poignant ritual commenced. The procession did not simply walk away. They retreated backwards, sweeping the ground with palm fronds or linen cloths, erasing every footprint, every drag mark from the coffin sled, every trace of their passage from the threshold to the valley floor. They were wiping the slate of the physical world clean, leaving no trail for the living to follow and no path for the king's spirit to wander back. A last basket of rubble was shoved across the entrance, and the natural scree of the cliff was artfully rearranged to hide the door forever. Then silence. The king was now utterly alone, sealed in his activated, stocked, and protected eternity. The 70 days of frantic preparation, the decades of construction, the labor of an entire city, all culminated in this profound stillness. The living had done all they could. The rest was up to the spells on the walls, the amulets on the bandages, and the lightness of a heart facing a feather in the hall of two truths. The door was sealed. The journey through the Duat had begun. But that sealed silence was never as permanent as the priests prayed it would be. A profound and tragic irony lay at the heart of the entire enterprise. The pharaohs built fortresses of eternity to last forever, yet many were stripped bare within a single generation. The very wealth they packed for the afterlife made their tombs the most tempting targets in the ancient world. When central authority weakened, when a dynasty fell, the sacred valley became a hunting ground. The robbers were not always shadowy outsiders. Often, they were the very people who knew the tombs best, the necropolis guards, the stonecutters from Deir el-Medina, or their sons and grandsons. They possessed inside knowledge of hidden entrances, the locations of secret chambers, and the weaknesses in the royal security. Their methods were pragmatic and ruthless. They would tunnel sideways through the bedrock to bypass sealed corridors, or quietly bribe the night watch to look the other way. Once inside, they worked with chilling efficiency, prying open sarcophagi, tearing gold leaf from coffins, and ripping precious amulets from mummy wrappings, often leaving the royal body desecrated on the chamber floor. We know these details not from legend, but from cold, bureaucratic records. The Abbot Papyrus, a transcript from a robbery trial during the reign of Ramesses IX, reads like a detective story. Officials interrogating a captured tomb robber named Amenpanufa describe his confession in stark detail. He recounts how he and his gang broke into the pyramid of a long-dead king, how they used copper tools to force their way in, and how they divided the loot, gold, silver, and costly linens, into 8 equal shares. The papyrus reveals a world where the sacred was just another commodity, and the fear of divine curses was outweighed by immediate, desperate need. This relentless human greed created a frantic race against time. The priests and architects were not just designing for eternity, they were engineering against the inevitable breach. Every granite portcullis, every hidden well shaft, and every inscribed curse was a desperate measure in a battle they were destined to lose. It adds a layer of heartbreaking realism to the story. For all their cosmic planning and divine magic, the ancient Egyptians could not finally defend against the most predictable force of all, the ambition and hunger of the living, who saw not a gateway to the gods, but a vault of unimaginable treasure waiting in the dark. The frantic efforts of the priests and guards were ultimately a losing battle against time and greed, which makes one discovery all the more miraculous. In November of 1922, after years of searching, archaeologist Howard Carter peered through a small hole into a forgotten tomb in the Valley of the Kings. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, asked anxiously if he could see anything. Carter's now legendary reply was, "Yes, wonderful things." He was witnessing a scene frozen for over 3,000 years. This was the tomb of Tutankhamun, a young king who ruled briefly and died unexpectedly around 1324 before the Common Era. His burial, rushed and housed in a modest tomb likely meant for a noble, was an accident of history. Because it was small, its entrance was soon buried by debris from the construction of a later pharaoh's tomb, hiding it from the eyes of generations of robbers. When Carter's team finally cleared the doorway and stepped inside, they were not entering a ransacked ruin. They were opening a perfect, dusty time capsule. The antechamber was in a state of organized chaos, as if the priests had just left. It was piled to the ceiling with objects, a golden throne inlaid with precious stones, disassembled chariots with gold foil gleaming, alabaster vessels, ornate beds carved to resemble animals, and a stunning golden shrine guarded by gilded statues of the king. Further in, the treasury and burial chamber held even greater wonders. The most iconic was the solid gold death mask weighing over 22 pounds, its lapis lazuli and quartz eyes gazing into eternity with serene perfection. And at the heart of it all, within a nest of 3 coffins and a quartzite sarcophagus, lay the mummy of the boy king himself, still adorned with a breathtaking array of gold jewelry, daggers, and amulets. The sheer volume was staggering, with over 5,000 objects catalogued. Yet for all its lavish spectacle, Tutankhamun was a relatively minor pharaoh. His tomb gives us the only complete picture of the ritual blueprint executed in full. We can see the exact arrangement of shrines around the sarcophagus, the placement of guardian statues, the careful storage of shabti workers and model boats for the solar journey. Every item from the grandest chariot to the simplest loaf of bread was in its prescribed place, a functioning machine for resurrection exactly as the priests intended. This completeness throws the loss of others into heartbreaking relief. Contrast this with the tomb of a mighty ruler like Ramesses II. His burial was undoubtedly 100 times more magnificent, the product of decades of planning and the full resources of an empire at its peak. Yet when archaeologists found his sarcophagus, it was empty, his mummy stripped and relocated by ancient priests in a desperate attempt to save it from looters. All that gold, all those spells, all that grandeur gone. Tutankhamun's modest, cluttered chambers are therefore our primary evidence. They are not a record of the greatest burial Egypt could produce, but a perfectly preserved snapshot of the standard divine process, allowing us to finally see the intricate clockwork of eternity with all its pieces still in place. The sealed tombs left behind were far more than silent monuments. They were the beating heart of an entire civilization, a national project that shaped every aspect of Egyptian life for centuries. This relentless focus on the afterlife created a powerful economic engine, one that employed thousands and drove innovation across multiple industries. To build a single royal tomb required a vast, coordinated network. Quarrymen worked in distant desert wadis, extracting the fine limestone and sandstone for walls and statues. Their efforts were mirrored by miners who ventured into the eastern mountains and the deserts of Nubia in search of gold, the flesh of the gods, and turquoise for dazzling inlays. This demand for luxury did not stop at Egypt's borders. It fueled international trade on a grand scale. Egyptian ships sailed to the distant coast of modern-day Lebanon to bring back enormous trunks of cedar wood, prized for its sweet scent and durability for coffins and temple doors. They traded with kingdoms to the south for ebony, ivory, and exotic animal skins. The tomb, as an end product, sat at the apex of a sprawling supply chain that connected farmers, artisans, sailors, and foreign merchants, binding the economy to a single, sacred purpose. This obsession with eternity did more than shape pockets, it shaped consciences. The theological concepts that governed the afterlife, particularly the judgment of Ma'at, seeped deeply into the bedrock of social ethics and daily law. Ma'at was not just a feather on a scale, she was the principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice that held the universe together. To live in accordance with Ma'at meant to live a balanced, ethical life. This was powerfully codified in the wisdom literature taught to scribes and officials, texts that instructed them to be fair, to care for the poor, and to speak truthfully. A vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister, was called the priest of Ma'at, and his courtroom was a place where her ideal was meant to prevail. The famous negative confession from the Book of the Dead, where the deceased declares, "I have not stolen, I have not caused anyone to weep," reflects a mirrored standard for the living. The fear of a heavy heart in the afterlife provided a powerful divine sanction for moral behavior, encouraging social harmony and reinforcing the pharaoh's role as the ultimate guarantor of order on earth. The preparation for death, therefore, became a blueprint for how to live. There is a profound paradox at work here. A culture so intensely focused on what came after death became one of history's most vibrant engines for cultural and technological achievement in the land of the living. The need to create perfect, eternal vessels pushed artisans to master new techniques. Tomb painters developed brilliant, mineral-based pigments that could last for millennia in the dark. Sculptors perfected methods for working with incredibly hard stones like granite and diorite. Architects and engineers solved complex logistical problems, moving multi-ton stones and ventilating deep tunnels, knowledge that then benefited temple and city construction. The entire system of writing and literacy was largely sustained by the need for funerary texts and tomb inscriptions, preserving the language and spawning a rich body of literature, from magical spells to love poetry. The art that adorns tomb walls, intended as magical provisions, gives us an unparalleled window into their world. their agriculture, their boats, their clothing, their religious ceremonies. In striving to create a perfect replica of life for the dead, they inadvertently created the most complete record of their own lives for the future. The legacy of ancient Egypt as we understand it today, the awe-inspiring temples, the captivating art, the philosophical depth of its texts is largely the magnificent byproduct of a society pouring its greatest wealth, its finest minds, and its most profound hopes into the silent, waiting stone of the West Bank. Their drive to conquer death, in the end, granted them a form of immortality they could never have imagined. The silent perfection of Tutankhamun's tomb gives us a finished product, but modern science now lets us peer beneath the wrappings and behind the walls, listening to whispers they never intended us to hear. Our understanding of their death preparations is no longer static. It is a living story constantly rewritten by technology. Take the royal mummies themselves. For over a century, they were studied with reverence, but also with invasive methods that damaged the very bodies meant for eternity. Today, non-invasive tools like CT scanners have revolutionized this work. In a quiet lab, a team can place a 3,000-year-old pharaoh into a medical scanner, and without unwrapping a single layer of linen, they can map the entire body in exquisite digital detail. The scans of Ramesses III, for instance, revealed a shocking truth beneath his regal bandages. The images showed a deep, fatal knife wound across his throat, providing the first physical evidence confirming ancient papyrus accounts of a harem conspiracy to assassinate the king. These scans do more than solve cold cases. They reveal the health of an entire civilization. We can see the arthritic spines of scribes, the dental abscesses that plagued even royalty, and the parasitic infections carried by the Nile's waters. We can examine the embalmer's work with new eyes, spotting the amulets hidden within the wrappings, the precise packing materials in the skull, and even the occasional tool left behind by a rushing priest. The ritual is no longer just a description in a text. It is a three-dimensional blueprint we can navigate virtually. This scientific curiosity extends to the objects that surrounded the mummy. The contents of those elegant canopic jars and alabaster offering vessels were long a mystery, their original substances dried to unidentifiable dust. Now, through a technique called residue analysis, chemists can take a tiny sample from the interior of a jar and analyze its molecular fingerprint. They have identified traces of ancient foods, beeswax from honey, traces of barley beer, and the fats from specific cuts of beef. On the lids of jars meant for sacred oils, they have detected the chemical signatures of rare resins like pistacia and conifer, mapping the trade routes that brought these precious substances to the embalmer's table. Even the black resin used to coat mummies, once thought to be simply bitumen, has been shown through analysis to sometimes be a complex mixture of pine tar, animal fats, and plant oils, each ingredient chosen for its symbolic and preservative properties. These findings transform a static artifact into a dynamic story. A simple pottery jug becomes a container for a specific vintage of wine, selected for the king's eternal table. The analysis confirms the meticulousness of their provisioning, proving that the painted images of abundance were backed by real, costly substances. The most human voices, however, come not from the tombs of kings, but from the lives of the workers who built them. The official history is carved in stone, but the informal one is scratched into the walls. Throughout the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists have found casual graffiti left by the workmen of Deir el-Medina. A stone might bear a simple sketch of a pharaoh, a playful animal, or a personal name and date. These are not acts of vandalism, they are casual signatures of presence, a way for an individual to say, "I was here, I built this." They reveal the human scale of the operation. The detailed administrative records from the village, written on ostraka limestone flakes or pottery shards used as notepaper, add incredible social depth. We read work logs noting absenteeism for reasons like brewing beer or fighting with his wife. we see records of tool issues, of payments in grain and fish, and of legal disputes between neighbors over a noisy donkey or a stolen pot. These fragments show us that the builders of eternity still worried about the rent, got into squabbles, and celebrated with a drink. They remind us that this grand spiritual endeavor was powered by ordinary people with familiar daily concerns, grounding the cosmic in the wonderfully, relatably mundane. Each of these scientific and historical threads adds a new layer of color to our understanding. We are no longer just observers of their finished ritual. We are becoming active investigators in an ongoing inquest. Every CT scan, every chemical analysis, every translated piece of worker graffiti is like finding a new piece of a vast, intricate puzzle. The ancient Egyptians built for eternity, believing their practices were complete and perfect. Yet in their quest for permanence, they left behind a legacy that is constantly changing, constantly revealing new secrets, ensuring that their story is never truly finished and their silent valley never completely still. From that first ritual incision to the final sweep of the broom across a hidden doorway, the ancient Egyptians orchestrated a 70-day symphony for the soul. It was a staggering convergence of faith, art, science, and state power, all directed toward a single, breathtakingly ambitious goal: to build a bridge across the one abyss every human must face. They turned their greatest fear into their most profound creation. In their desperate, beautiful drive to ensure life after death, they constructed an entire parallel world, a world of sacred chemistry in the embalming tent, of painted magic on tomb walls, of echoing chants in mortuary temples, and of quiet hopes in a workers' village perched above the valley. This was not a morbid obsession, but a vibrant, all-consuming project that defined their civilization. And here lies the profound paradox. Their terror of being forgotten, of vanishing into the silent dark, compelled them to create things meant to last forever. In seeking to conquer death, they achieved a kind of immortality, not for their individual souls, which we can never truly know, but for their civilization itself. The gold, the gods, the grand narratives of judgment and rebirth, all of it continues to resonate, captivate, and puzzle us thousands of years later. Their monuments stand not as tombstones, but as invitations. They ask us to consider what we build, what we value, and what pieces of ourselves we hope might endure when we, too, must make that final crossing. So we turn the question to you after this journey from the beautiful house to the Hall of Two Truths. Which part of this ancient preparation fascinated you the most? Was it the sacred science of mummification, the psychological warfare of the tomb curses, or the simple, human stories of the workers at Deir el-Medina? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to join more explorations into the heart of historical mysteries, be sure to subscribe.